I'm Janine Turner, founder of Constituting America. Thanks for joining our 90-day annual study. It's entitled 90 plus 90 equals 180. History holds the key to the future. This year's study is The Genius of America, a journey into our republic, a study on Alexis De Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Here's a quote by Alexis De Tocqueville. The Senate is usually a legislative body, but sometimes it becomes an administrative and judicial body. This essay is entitled The Necessity of Examining What Happened in Individual States Before Considering the Union as a Whole, Volume 1, Part 1, Chapter 5, Subchapters 9 to 11 of Democracy in America by Alexis De Tocqueville. Guest essayist, Scot, Faulkner. The core of America's federal system of government is viable state governments. America is called the United States to institutionalize the importance of distributed and diverse state governance as a balance to centralized power. De Tocqueville fully understood this unique America concept by declaring, quote, the necessity of examining what happened in individual states before considering the Union as a whole, end quote. State legislatures, except Nebraska, mirror the two legislative chambers at the national level. In 1934, Nebraskans voted to merge their two legislative houses, determining unicameralism would be more efficient and cheaper. The concept of two legislative chambers at both the national and state levels began with the royal charter that established Jamestown in Virginia. It evolved from the charter holders into governance by the king's representative, the royal governor, and his advisory council. This evolved into the Senate at both the national and state level. As de Tocqueville explains, quote, the Senate is usually a legislative body, but sometimes it becomes an administrative and judicial body, end quote. A state's House of Representatives, called the House of Delegates in some states, also has its roots in Jamestown. When the settlers demanded their own voice, the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1619 became the democratically elected legislative body in America. De Tocqueville explains the difference. Quote, the other branch of the legislature, ordinarily called the House of Representatives, participates in no administrative power and takes part in judicial power only by accusing public officials before the Senate, end quote. The House of Burgesses became a proving ground for what would become the lower house at the national and state levels. Upper and lower house designations were derived from their locations within Jamestown's legislative building. The House of Burgesses was located on the ground floor, while the governor's advisory council met on the second floor. Drawing from the British tradition, the members of the House held their positions for shorter periods of time to be held closely accountable by those they represented. De Tocqueville explains, quote, by granting to the senators the privilege of being chosen for several years and being renewed seriatim, the law takes care to preserve in the legislative body a nucleus of men already accustomed to public business and capable of exercising a salutary influence upon the junior members, end quote. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, writing under the pseudonym Publius, outlined this binding of the House of Representatives more closely to those they served in Federalist Number 52, quote, frequent elections are unquestionably the only policy by which this dependence and sympathy can be effectually secured. It is a received and well-founded maxim that where no other circumstances affect the case, the greater the power is, the shorter ought to be its duration, end quote. This unique legislative environment of having different terms and therefore different mandates, perspectives, was considered a strength by de Tocqueville. Quote, to divide legislative strength, thus to slow the movement of political assemblies, and to create a court of appeal by the revision of laws. Such are the sole advantages that result from the current constitutions of the two houses in the United States. End quote. De Tocqueville embraced the universal wisdom of how America's state legislatures governed. Quote, this theory, nearly ignored in ancient republics, introduced into the world almost haphazardly like most great truths, unknown to several modern peoples, has at length passed into the political science of our day as an axiom. End quote. De Tocqueville then turns his attention to state governors. He outlines the governor's role as a, quote, moderator and counsel, end quote. This is very different from the powerful royal governors they replaced. Governors served as a counterbalance to the legislature as a chamber balances each other. This institutionalized series of, quote, checks and balances, end quote, creates a web of accountability at both the state and national level. The lessons learned from royal overreach were embedded to prevent future tyranny. Governors also have the power to, quote, stop or at least to slow movement, end quote, of legislation. This check on legislative power arises from the lessons learned from the English Revolution, 1640 to 1660, when Charles I's royal tyranny was replaced with Oliver Cromwell's legislative dictatorship. A governor, in their role as moderator, do set, quote, out the needs of the country to the legislative body and make it known what means he judges useful to employ in order to provide for them, end quote. The legislature's role is to approve or reject the governor's agenda, serving as a balance to executive power. De Tocqueville, who had previously outlined the importance of local government in America, explains that, quote, the governor does not enter into the administration of townships and counties, end quote. Each level of government in America has its own role, power, and independence. From the national level on down to local communities, America's strength is a structure that prevents centralized tyranny. This essay was written by Scot Faulkner. Scot Faulkner was the Chief Administrative Officer of the U.S. House of Representatives. Earlier, he served on the White House staff. He is Vice President of the George Washington Institute of Living Ethics at Shepherd University and the President of Friends of Harper's Ferry National Historical Park.